Okay, folks, welcome back. This is the second lecture in the stress and addiction theme. It's a very apt theme these days. I feel like everyone is very stressed out. Lecture 2 is about the brain, and really this theme more than anything is about the brain, because a lot of folks will tell you that addiction is a brain disease, and really important idea in learning about the human body and personality and just what makes us who we are as the brain. A lot of us believe that all things have some kind of physical or chemical basis, whether we're talking about emotions, whether we're talking about memories, or talking about things like love, or even spirituality, that there is some kind of physical underlying foundation for those things. Not that that's the reason why they occur, that you have to exclude a God or any kind of spiritual aspect, but just the fact that we experience those things because of some part of our brain. Okay, and so we're going to talk about a little bit more specifics of this. And then when we next lecture is about the endocrine system, and that really touches on stress. And then we're going to start talking about how addiction and stress, as we experience them, are related to this physiology. Here, this slide, the first slide in the lecture, sort of review from the first lecture, talking about the two major components of the nervous system: the central nervous system, which includes the brain, and the spinal cord. Okay, our spinal column is just a series of vertebrae. There are bony elements with a hole in them where the spinal cord runs through, and then attached to and coming off of the spinal cord are all of our peripheral nerves. Okay, that's the peripheral nervous system. And this whole system basically acts to coordinate the rest of the body's systems, and to collect information about our environment and then respond appropriately. Okay, well, the first question in the study questions is about meninges, and these are connective tissue or linings that line the brain and the spinal cord, by the way. So basically the entire central nervous system is coated with a meninge, because inside of the central nervous system, flowing through it, is this fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so those meninges contain that cerebrospinal fluid. The brain is actually hollow. We see this large cavity on the inside of it that allows the cerebrospinal fluid to get inside of the brain, and then down the inside of the spinal cord. So if you have a spinal tap that is basically piercing through the inside of the spinal cord to gather a little of that cerebrospinal fluid, oftentimes to look for diseases like meningitis. Also, if a woman gets I'm trying to think of the name of this, basically a spinal block, if she's about to give birth to a baby, and they can give an injection directly into the spinal cord, that prevents her from feeling any pain sort of below that point. The cerebrospinal fluid, it nourishes all these trillions of cells that are in the brain and in the spinal cord, and it also removes waste. So it brings things like glucose, it brings salt, it brings water, takes away any metabolic waste. And there's a lot of evidence that during sleep, there's one part of the sleep, and it's on brain scans, it kind of looks like a slow wash cycle in a dishwasher. and the cerebrospinal fluid washes over the brain. It's these slow rhythmic waves, and it seems like that's about nourishing and washing, cleansing the brain. And again, that's very interesting. There's some evidence that if you don't get the right sleep, if you have sleep disorders, then you're much more likely to develop things like Alzheimer's later in life, because the brain is not removing those toxins that come along with metabolism. So meninges related to the word meningitis. So itis is basically like an inflammation or disease of a given structure. So meningitis can be either viral or bacterial, and bacterial meningitis is very dangerous, can lead to very high fevers and death pretty quickly. So something to watch out for. Okay, so that peripheral nervous system can be broken down into two major systems, the motor system and the autonomic system. The motor system is largely voluntary, and this is controlling skeletal muscle. So muscle contraction is accomplished by the motor portion of the peripheral nervous system. But it's not all voluntary, right? So if you think if you're sitting, you're maintaining a posture, you're not really thinking about all those different muscles involved. Or when you're walking either, think about trying to balance your whole body on your feet, all those muscles that are involved in your feet, your calves, all the way up your back, your neck, right? That keep us upright. So the autonomic portion of the peripheral nervous system. So you think of autonomic as kind of like automatic. These are not things that are voluntarily happen. They are sort of just happen automatically, and that is at the behest of the autonomic nervous system. And that can be further split into the parasympathetic and sympathetic division of the autonomic peripheral nervous system. Parasympathetic, these are the nerves that control the rest and digest response. So if you eat, oftentimes you get sleepy, right? That's because your body is trying to tell you that parasympathetic division kicks in. It's trying to lower your blood pressure. It's trying to lower your stress hormones and really allow you to digest your food fully and absorb that food. Sympathetic division is involved with the stress response, which again can be adaptive if you are in danger. A little urgency is not a bad thing, and this autonomic nervous system largely acts by stimulating glands in the endocrine system, really which we're going to talk about next time. So the sympathetic division is central to our story of stress. So a lot of times when we experience stress, it's because of some hormone in our endocrine system, which was stimulated by the sympathetic division of your autonomic peripheral nervous system. Okay. Just memorize those. Okay, the brain, central nervous system. We're going to look at some real basic areas of the brain and where you find them. You should be able to label this kind of a diagram, and you should understand generally what is going on in these different parts of the brain. Okay, and for me, a kind of a helpful way to think about the human brain is really through the eye of evolution and thinking about which is the oldest parts of the brain, which are the newest parts of the brain. Okay, and the human brain is not really much different than other animals. You can find a lot of these same structures and everything down to a fish. Oftentimes we use sheep brains to study anatomy of the human brain because they're really that similar. Okay, so the oldest part of the brain would be here in what's called the brainstem. Okay, and then adding on to that the cerebellum, and then the cerebrum. Okay, and so not surprisingly, the more advanced portions of the brain, the things that really make us human and make us unique and different, are here in the cerebrum. Okay, things that are more just animalistic. In fact, a lot of times people call the brainstem the reptile brain. Okay, because these are things that are very ancient, going way back to our reptile ancestors. Okay, so the brainstem here, shown in green, is including the midbrain, the pons, medulla oblongata, cerebellum here in blue, and then hypothalamus underneath the cerebrum, right? And then the cerebral cortex is just this really folded, very thin outer layer of the cerebrum. Okay. Pituitary gland is attached to and associated with the hypothalamus. So let's look at each of these individual parts and what they do. But again, thinking about this from the standpoint of old reptilian parts of the brain and more advanced mammalian type of parts of the brain. Okay, so that outer layer, this is where the sophisticated heavy lifting goes on. This is where calculus happens. This is where memory formation, ability to learn, ability to process language and speak, experience different emotions, and formulate behavioral responses. Okay, so the higher order thinking happens in the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus, again, is found down underneath that, and this is a much older part of the brain, and this is related to that autonomic nervous system, the automatic nervous system. Okay, so it's a more of a regulatory part of the brain associated with hormones in the endocrine system. Okay, the cerebellum is about muscle tone and sort of positional information and regulating the complex movement of our body. This brain stem, the oldest part of the brain here, these are just very vital, very simple, non-voluntary, involuntary actions, such as visual reflexes, or taking input from the spinal column and the peripheral nervous system, and then sending up to the cerebrum and the cerebellum and different parts of the brain that need to integrate and coordinate that. The pons is where breathing happens. Again, breathing is both voluntary and involuntary. You don't need to think about each and every breath, but you can also voluntarily override that and control your breathing. Medulla oblongata, talking about things like blood pressure, swallowing, digestion, things that you don't really have to think about. Your body just does. Okay. The hypothalamus, we'll talk about that a little bit more. This is, again, associated with the endocrine system and hormones by way of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so affecting things like, this is sort of, you think about this as the homeostatic part of the brain. This maintains our homeostasis. It determines when your blood doesn't have enough water, your hypothalamus sends the message to for you to experience the sensation of being thirsty. When your eyes encounter something that is scary, then the hypothalamus produces the fight or flight hormones, right? Sex drive, body temperature regulation, things that are very sort of fundamental and primitive type of functions are controlled here in the hypothalamus. Okay, and also it's involved with emotion to a degree. Some real base emotions like pleasure and rage, things like that. Okay, so we will touch on this when we talk about addiction. Cerebrum, again, this is the biggest, most sophisticated part of our brain. The cerebral cortex is very thin but folded layer. So the sort of classic appearance of the brain with all those folds, when you look at a brain, that's pretty much you're looking at the cerebral cortex. So that's all about surface area. Lots and lots of cerebral cortex areas folded in there. And so really what makes us human takes place in this part of the brain. Okay, so our ability to think mathematically, our ability to form language verbally, ability to sort of abstractly represent things in the world through art, music, and our personality comes in here in the cerebral cortex. Okay, and there's two hemispheres, the right and the left hemisphere, and of course the right hemisphere controls the left part of the body and vice versa. There is a connection between those two hemispheres, and that's called the corpus callosum. Okay, it's this thick bundle of fibers, so white matter that bridges those two sides, and that ability to process information from both sides simultaneously is important. And we see if there's reduced volume or abundance of these nerve fibers in the corpus callosum, there's association with learning disabilities, some behavioral disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder seems to be related to this thinning of the corpus callosum. And again, a lot of things with the brain, it's sort of a chicken and egg. Is it that, for example, if you are a musician, then if you scan your brain, you'll see some physical differences with other people who do not play the violin or whatever. So it's kind of hard to tell if the physical change in the brain causes the trait or vice versa. But suffice to say, this corpus callosum appears to be very important in regulating behavior and things like that, and in learning. Okay. So here we see that left and right hemisphere and the corpus callosum connection between the two. So, this is, people talk about being left brain or right brain, whether you're sort of scientific or whether you're artistic. And I don't know, brain science-wise, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that it's really that simple. Okay, so I think that's more of just an easy way to keep track of people's personalities. I don't think it has a lot of physical basis here. So again, we're looking back of the brain. You see the medulla oblongata at the bottom of the brainstem, the cerebellum in the back underneath the cerebrum, regulating and coordinating movement. Again, so the cerebral cortex can be broken down further into these functional areas. And again, in this class we are learning some fairly basic stuff. The more we learn about the brain, right, they're targeting individual neurons and their functional significance. Okay, so we're just learning real big, broad picture of the brain structure and function. Okay, there's the integrative association areas, there are sensory areas, and there's motor areas. Okay, and so we're going to look at the map of the brain, just again these general areas shown here, but each of the areas is responsible for something unique. However, there are lots of interactions between those areas. For example, something like facial recognition. There are people who cannot recognize face, and I think that's in that movie 50 First Dates. The lady had brain damage and couldn't recognize or remember faces. And that's true. This is a real condition. And that's because if you think about it, you have to be able to visually see somebody. You need to recognize specific aspects or characteristics of the face. And then you need to be able to access a memory of those characteristics. And then you need to be able to tie that to a visual word and to be able to communicate it. And so lots of complex things happen for something that's real seemingly simple. And really we've learned a lot about the brain and its function and structure by studying people who have something wrong with their brain, something different about the brain. So injuries, diseases, things like that often lead to a new understanding of the brain structure and function. Some pretty wild stories out there. Okay, so here is that cerebral cortex. See in the back, so this would be the front. Eye would be here, ear, the back of your skull here. Cerebral cortex associated with vision and associative type of things. That's called the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe here, we see senses of speech, taste, smell. Well, no, speech and taste, and also sense of touch, somatosensory area. Okay. The temporal lobe, we see the sense of smell, the sense of hearing, and then the auditory association area. So again, you can make these associations between different ideas either by a sound or by a smell or by a visual cue. Okay. I think really the sense of smell is particularly powerful when forming memories. I don't know, for me at least, if I smell something, that will bring back a memory more quickly than of a sound or something that I see. Frontal association area here is really just a area that's sort of, I guess you could say, accepts information from all the other areas and is sort of overall coordinating area. So it's really the part of the brain that puts it all together and helps you to form associations, form memories, and we'll talk about this frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, and about how that's involved with decision making, ability to weigh risk, and these kind of things. So again, how do we know what the brain does? A lot of times we don't know until something happens, right? So there's this guy, Phineas Gage, and he worked on the railroad. He and a lot of times when you're making a railroad, you just have to blast through a mountain. There's big areas of rock that you need to get out of there. So maybe they'll drill a hole, they'll put dynamite in there, then they've got this metal rod that they tamp that down into the hole. He's doing this, charge goes off, the spike comes up through his head, through his cheek, through his eye, orbital socket, and up into his frontal lobe of his brain. Okay, and this one, and he lived for many years after that, in fact, but just a freak accident, and he was lucky enough to live. But this happened, I think, in the 1800s. What did it say when that happened? Yeah, 1848. So again, that's about 40 years before Reinhardt was formed. And probably more than any single event, this got scientists thinking about, again, this physical foundation of human spirit, really. Personality, memory, ability to tell time, all these things. So Phineas Gage, before the accident, was an exemplary worker. He shows up every day on time, has a good attitude, he works hard, keeps track of his tasks, sees them through to the end. After his accident, all of his closest friends and family said his entire personality changed. He just kind of became sullen, he became irritable, pessimistic. He was not good-humored. He would show up late, would not finish his jobs. And so this really got people wondering about that part of his brain, right? That's part of the brain here, and what happens, what's accomplished in the brain, and whether damage to that part of the brain could result in all these things that they noticed about Phineas. And that's becoming clear now that that's exactly what happened, right? So that part of the cerebral cortex and the frontal lobe, it's called the prefrontal cortex, and especially you educators, I know that you will learn about the prefrontal cortex in your education classes. In psychology, this is a very important part of the brain. This is the part of the brain, again, that it can project into the future. It can sort of weigh different scenarios. If I do this, if I do that, what the risks involved with the scenarios are. It can weigh the benefits. It can, come to a decision, and allows you to make good decisions. Okay, when that part of the brain is strong. But we know from studying the brain that that part of the brain does not fully develop until the mid-20s, maybe up to 25 years old. Okay, and so really we know that adolescence is a difficult time in life, and that death rates spike. We see people just making stupid decisions during that time of their life, and it turns out that there is some physical foundation in this, so that the brain is not developed fully, the prefrontal cortex is not developed, and so accordingly, people don't make good decisions. They can't be trusted to make good decisions. That's why, again, I tell my daughter this. So that's why I have to be the parent, and I have to make those decisions for her. Really, mental health issues and these disorders such as ADHD, Alzheimer's, autism, there's so many different, depression, anxiety. These are things that really are very common and cost our society a lot of good hard work. And we are getting a better and better understanding them as we understand the brain. So there's some evidence that ADHD is related to the development of the prefrontal cortex, and that if that delay, the maturation of that part of the brain is delayed, then it could be related to development of adult ADHD. Right? So think about it. What's ADHD? You can't focus. Impulsive. And what is the impulse? Again, this is one part of your brain says to do, that, to hit the person, to buy this, to drive fast. Well, the prefrontal cortex is sort of like that part of the brain that's saying like, well, I don't think that's a good idea. If you accelerate fast, you're going to lose friction, you're going to slide off the road. If you, go out drinking tonight, you are not going to study and you will do poorly on the test tomorrow. So if that part of the brain is not developed, right, then that's sort of the definition of ADHD. Okay, but it's not just ADHD. We're seeing that even the shape of the brain and the activity of certain parts of the brain differ among people, and that can be correspondent with things like dyslexia, schizophrenia. All these different disorders are starting to make more sense as we have new technologies to visualize the brain. Things like functional MRI. We can put people in this scanners. We can show them different pictures and we can see which parts of the brain are active. Alzheimer's disease. Horrible disease, right? I don't know if, my grandfather died of Alzheimer's. And eventually, basically, I feel like these people who start to develop Alzheimer's, that person that you know disappears, right? Their memories go, the personality changes. Very oftentimes, if you lose your memory, you start getting very confused, right? And it's sort of a mystery at this point what causes Alzheimer's. But we do see commonly in victims of Alzheimer's, parts of their temporal lobe, right, start to deteriorate and are less active. And so it seems like there's some foundation of that. Age-related too. CTE. Hear about this a lot too. So many of our students are athletes, and we hear about lots of concussions, and these are things not to be taken lightly, right? Something the NFL has looked at very closely. These repeated brain traumas, and then later in life, right, you hear about people, high rates of depression, personality changes, behavioral issues, even to the point of developing criminal behavior, and these are associated with parts of the brain basically deteriorating, right? The frontal and temporal lobes. Okay. Depression also related to differences in activity in the brain. So here's two brains, a healthy person, a person with major depression. Again, I hope that at some point along the way you guys will shift your thinking about depression if you already haven't. Okay, I always thought depression as being something that, people are just being emo and woe is me, but this is the real physical disorder. It has its foundations in brain activity. And we know that parts of the temporal lobe, things like the amygdala, the hippocampus, are directly involved with regulation of mood. They are involved with our perception of the world. They are involved with decision making. They're involved with motivation, right? And so these are all things that people who have major depression can experience, sort of like a whole new lens on their glasses. When they look at the world, they see things very differently than you and I would. And it makes it very difficult for them to be motivated to really do much of anything. It makes it difficult to make decisions. And those really, I think, result in the thing that we see or think of as the changes in mood. People feel very sad. But it goes way beyond that, right? It goes to this basically just the will to get up out of bed in the morning. Okay, and again, here's that. You can see this in a brain scan. The parts that are lighting up have decreased activity. Okay, and again, I think that society is coming around now to the point where we're not going to punish people for the way that their brain works, and we're not going to punish people who have depression, and that we're developing some empathy for folks who have these disorders, and that we are finding ways to treat them. Some really fascinating treatments for these. Some different new drugs coming online. Ketamine, which is sort of a party drug. Horse tranquilizer. There's some evidence that very high doses of ketamine can break people out of their depression. Even psilocybin mushrooms. Some treatments there that are helping folks. Also, sort of, I can't remember what it's called. Hemispheric stimulation. So it's basically like a magnetic or electrical stimulation, and very targeted parts of the brain can help to jumpstart the activity in those parts of the brain. And there's some really promising results of reducing people's depressive symptoms. And we talked last time about the neurotransmitters, especially serotonin and these SSRIs, how they, by inhibiting reuptake of serotonin, they boost the level of serotonin in that part of the brain. But then again, if you look how many people in this country are taking SSRIs and how many people still are experiencing depression, there's not a lot of evidence that these things work that well. So certainly something we need to further our understanding of. So again, I guess to recap, the brain is very complex, and each area of the brain has a very specific job, specific function, and as we learn about those through brain scanning, through people with different diseases. I heard about this lady who had seizures and epilepsy, and they basically went into her brain and cut out a certain part of her brain that was causing the seizures. And after that, she really had no sense of time. She was always late for everything. She had trouble recognizing faces, but that proved to make her like basically a professional ultra marathon runner. These kind of people that run day and night for a week through the Yukon. They run hundreds of miles, and there was some discussion of maybe she became such a good marathon runner because she had no sense of time. So a lot of that is psychological, right? You'd be like, oh my goodness, I've been running for 12 hours. I must be tired. Versus her brain didn't ever tell her she's been running for 12 hours. So she just sort of overcame that. A lot of really fascinating brain science coming out right now. And so where we're headed is how these parts of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the pituitary, are involved with stress, and then also how addiction and drug use can have a feedback loop where they actually affect parts of the brain, and how that can lead to these really inexplicable behaviors we see in addicts. Okay, folks, we'll see you